The question, what is consciousness, has been asked by mankind for thousands of years. And there are many opinions, books, and experts, including psychologists and philosophers, that attempt to answer the question, what is consciousness? However, even the psychologists and philosophers do not have a solid understanding of consciousness. Much of their knowledge is based on hypothesis, unproven assumptions, opinions, and speculations. In today's episode, we will be exploring Billy's explanation of consciousness. We will also be looking at the personality, the psyche, the feeling center, and other contributing components that make up our conscious experience. A recurring theme in Billy's books is the need for growth or evolution of our consciousness. But what exactly is consciousness? From a broad perspective, we are conscious of our external world and our internal selves. We can look at a tree, and at the same time, we can be aware of ourselves looking at the tree. A simple definition is, consciousness is what makes experience possible. Consciousness includes our thoughts, our feelings, our psyche, our personality, our I or ego, our character, memory, senses, and everything that we can experience and perceive. All of these things make up our conscious experience. However, while all of these things make up our conscious experience, they all have discrete functions that interact, condition, and influence each other. In order to grow our consciousness, we first need to learn about ourselves. This self-education is a lifelong process that can be very difficult and challenging. Learning about ourselves means to consciously perceive our thoughts, feelings, habits, and behaviors, which in some cases lead to difficult realizations and sometimes tears. Quite often, the image we have of ourselves is distorted, and we see the person we want to see and not the person we really are. However, we also have remarkable abilities, behaviors, and characteristics that we can be proud of. It's important to recognize all of our inner characteristics, both the positive ones that are more developed and the negative ones which need improvement. It's also important that during this self-education, we show ourselves the appropriate kindness, compassion, and respect, because we all have weaknesses, quirks, and bad behaviors that need to be changed once they've been recognized. Thinking negatively about oneself or other types of self-punishment are not useful and actually hinder the progress of self-education. It takes patience, understanding, and a great deal of profound thinking to achieve even a small success. And even the small successes need to be questioned and tested to make sure they are what we think they are and not something else. It's important to develop a new set of calm and self-instructive thoughts and feelings that will support and foster a healthy self-learning environment. In order to have a better understanding of how the consciousness works, let's start with a basic overview of the human consciousness, the different parts involved, and how impulses affect and condition different parts of the consciousness. The term impulse is a very specific term and can be misunderstood. So I'll quote a definition from The Goblet of Truth, one of Billy's books. Quote, "Everything in the whole universe consists of the movement of impulsations. Something goes in, something develops. Without movement, nothing would exist." End quote. So an impulse isn't something that just pulses, like the word may sound. It's something that goes in and then something develops. The human consciousness is made up of two distinct parts that constitute the whole: the material consciousness and the spiritual consciousness. In this video, we will be examining the material consciousness. This part of the consciousness is made up of many different parts and processes that contribute to our conscious experience. Billy calls this material part the personality consciousness block. This is a compound term, meaning this block is the personality and the consciousness together. Contained within the personality consciousness block is the mental block, the individuality block, and the subconsciousness block. There is one more block, and this is the central consciousness, which consists of two parts, the material central consciousness and the spiritual central consciousness. The central consciousness is only responsible for forwarding impulses between the material consciousness and the spiritual consciousness, so we'll cover this process in another video. The mental block contains the material consciousness, the actual thinking apparatus that we use during our lifetime. The material consciousness is comprised of numerous forms of consciousness, which includes all possible fields of knowledge. For example, if you work as an engineer, engineering could be a form of consciousness. Or, if you work in the medical field, those can be forms of consciousness. Maybe you're a mom or a dad, so parenting would be a form of consciousness. As we grow and learn, we create new forms of consciousness and expand existing forms of consciousness within us. Thinking and all thoughts originate in the consciousness. However, our thoughts are formed through many different processes, circumstances, experiences, and influences. The psyche manages consciousness-based thoughts and feelings, which arrive from the consciousness to the psyche via impulses. These impulses affect the psyche in either a positive or negative way, depending on the nature of the thought or feeling received. After the psyche receives a thought, the psyche sends an impulse to the feeling center, which is characterized as either negative or positive, depending on the state of the psyche. The feeling we are talking about here is not the feeling of touch, when you touch something or when someone touches you on the shoulder. The feelings we are talking about here are the internal ones that are perceived by our consciousness, such as gratitude, inspiration, anxiety, remorse, experiencing music or art, or sentimental feelings. Feelings represent a focused and actualized quality of experience in our lives. Feelings can be connected with our assessments of people or events, with memories of the past events, as well as with perceptions and understandings. Feelings are impulses that can be initiated from many different sources. The primary source of feelings is our thoughts. Some other sources include personal drive towards a goal and instinctual forms such as sensing danger. Feelings can also be generated directly by conditions of the personality. Purely physical processes also generate feeling formation, such as the autonomic nervous system and the central nervous system, and many other physiological processes. The feeling center contains the entire palette of feelings that a human being is capable of. When the feeling center receives a negative or positive impulse, the corresponding feeling is sent to the consciousness, whereby a particular distinct mood will arise. As you can see from this diagram, our thoughts are a primary source of feelings. Our thinking of positive or negative thoughts affects the psyche either positively or negatively, in which case the psyche becomes unequalized or out of balance and enters into a negative or positive state. The psyche then sends impulses to the feeling center, and the feeling center sends a corresponding feeling to the consciousness. As an example, Mary was thinking about picking some flowers from her garden for a friend. Her positive thoughts of picking the flowers to cheer up her friend reached the psyche, which changed the psyche's state to positive, and then the corresponding impulse is sent to the feeling center, which generates a warm, loving feeling within her. Another example would be Mary notices a mean social media post about her. She then starts to think about how she could get back at the person. Her negative thoughts change her psyche to negatively unbalanced, and then an impulse is sent to the feeling center, whereby feelings of revenge become conscious in her mind. This can go even further, because now she thinks more along the lines of revenge, which continue to reinforce those thoughts with more feelings of revenge. In this simple example, we can see how our thoughts have a tremendous effect on our feelings, actions, and state of being. Emotions can be mistakenly identified with feelings. However, emotions and feelings are different. Emotions are impulses that are triggered by internal or external stimuli that strike like lightning and in many cases are uncontrollable. You've probably heard the term an emotional response. It's a quick impulse response that has unconscious thoughts preceding it. Because these thoughts are unconscious, we have no control over emotional impulses. We can only exercise some control after we recognize the emotion in our consciousness. In contrast, feelings manifest slowly and are always preceded by a thought. Feelings are generated through our own conscious and unconscious thinking. This means, at least for our conscious thinking, feelings can be controlled by controlling our thoughts. There's an easy experiment you can do yourself. Observe yourself inwardly. As you notice feelings arise, see if you can also observe the thoughts that preceded them. During this exercise, see if you can also observe the difference between feelings and emotions. It might take some work in the beginning, but it's something you can observe and discover yourself. We often think, feel, and act instinctively and reactively in an unreasonable and emotionally charged manner without even thinking. And from this behavior, we create confusion, animosity, and lack of understanding among other human beings. When we get that lightning-fast emotional response in our consciousness, thoughts are generated, sending impulses to the psyche, which in turn generate feelings associated with the emotion, which end up back in the consciousness. This feedback loop that started with an emotion and led to feelings can be a very strong emotional or feeling state and can lead to actions such as acts of jealousy, violence, or revenge. Also within the mental block is the individuality block. The individuality block is still within and part of the mental block or consciousness. The individuality block contains the ego, the personality, the character, and memory. The most significant thing about these four aspects of ourselves is that all of them are created through our own thinking, feeling, behaviors, and actions. The ego, or I consciousness, is always demanding and selfish. Our I, or what we think of as ourselves, is often loud and has many tricks to get what it wants. It can justify our actions even though they may not be right, or it can use seductive voices to coerce us into action or inaction. Our personalities are not something we receive new at birth. They are created by each individual person through conscious efforts and intensive thought processing, which is a lifelong learning process. The character and its behavior and actions are formed and shaped by the consciousness and the personality. The character embodies the qualities or properties that define the individual nature of the personality. Some of these qualities are integrity, kindness, patience, persistence, open-mindedness, fairness, cooperativeness, and tolerance. Our character can also be dishonest, disrespectful, mean, selfish, and many other qualities. Our character is the product of our consciousness and our personality. The memory is used by the material consciousness to store all types of perceptions, experiences, teachings, things heard, things felt, and all of life's experiences. Our memory stores this information so it can be recalled later by the material consciousness. Memories can generate feelings. For example, visiting the place where you grew up could recall memories to the material consciousness that would generate thoughts and feelings. The subconsciousness sends impulses that are instructive and helpful to our consciousness. These impulses can be instructive and helpful if we notice them. They are very subtle and are only noticeable if we are diligent in our observation and balanced in our thinking. For many, the busyness of daily life makes it almost impossible to recognize these subconscious impulses. All of our actions are controlled and initiated by one of our forms of consciousness. As an example, let's say you and another person were talking and the other person said something that offended you. Maybe he insulted you. The ego or I consciousness would say to you, "Hey, he insulted me," and maybe even suggest, "You're not going to let him get away with that, are you?" Or even, "You need to show him who's boss." These types of thoughts send negatively polarized impulses to the psyche, causing the psyche to become negatively unbalanced. Then the psyche sends negatively polarized impulses to the feeling center, after which the feeling center sends feelings of bitterness, which you become conscious of. Then your thoughts turn to this feeling of bitterness, and after a few seconds of thinking about the bitterness, the same cycle ensues, and then feelings of animosity arise. Then, after thinking about the animosity, feelings of revenge become noticeable in your consciousness. This is an example of how the I consciousness, along with the personality, creates thoughts, and how these thoughts get perpetuated and escalated without some thought intervention through self-observation. It's important that we learn to recognize and then learn about this process that goes on in our consciousness every day of our lives. Using this example, it's also important to know that the psyche not only manages our thoughts and feelings, but also directly affects our physical bodies. When thoughts and feelings are observed from a purely physiological standpoint, they are simply a mixture of chemicals and electrical circuits in the brain. The psyche is located in our physical bodies between the breasts, just above the solar plexus area. The solar plexus is made up of two nerve bundles called ganglion, and these nerves are closely connected to the psyche. When the psyche is affected either negatively or positively, it has a big effect on our physical bodies, including the productions of hormones and brain chemicals, including dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, and adrenaline. And conversely, the health and vitality of the physical body plays an important role in the formation of feelings through the psyche. This completes a very general overview of our personality consciousness block. As you can see, there's a lot of different processes going on in our consciousness. For the majority of us, very little time is spent looking inwardly, observing our thoughts, feelings, and our behavior. The majority of our time is spent looking outward. We are concerned with our job, our position or rank in society, and acquiring material wealth far beyond what is needed for daily life, and a general disregard for our fellow human beings. Thinking, or the action of thinking, isn't just letting some random thought run off into the wild to see where it might go. Real thinking is a determinative act that we can exercise in our consciousness. Thinking is observing our thoughts, dissecting, analyzing, and evaluating the cause and source of the thought. And if we don't do this, then our thoughts just run empty into the distance without any comprehension, and we let ourselves be led around with what Billy calls flying thought scraps. Real thinking is dissecting and analyzing the thoughts that go through our consciousness. There's a practical application you might try yourself. A little earlier, we talked about emotions and feelings. A good exercise is to try and observe yourself and see if you can distinguish the difference between what's an emotion and what's a feeling. It's fairly easy to do. You simply observe yourself with your consciousness when you begin to notice feelings. Try and see if you can notice the thought that preceded the feeling. If the feeling was initiated by a conscious thought, you should be able to recognize it. If it was an unconscious thought, then you're out of luck, because it was an unconscious thought you wouldn't be conscious of it. But many of our feelings are preceded by conscious thoughts, so there is a possibility of noticing it if we take the time and effort to observe ourselves. And this exercise can be done while jogging, driving to work, during work, really any time at all. Well, that concludes a very basic introduction to the material consciousness. Feel free to post any comments or questions below, and we'll see you on the next video.